But something we haven't touched on, which was a huge monkey wrench in the convention and probably sowed the seeds for the Civil War, was the issue of slavery. And as you can imagine, the southern states and the southern delegates really wanted to defend their stance on slavery and wanted that to be represented, um, because so much of their population was slaves, and especially when it came to representation and the issue of proportional representation, it's how would the slaves be counted. So how much of a monkey wrench was slavery in the convention?
Well, it kept coming up, and it was not anything the delegates wanted to deal with. Uh, all of them understood, and I, I am positive that there was no delegate there who thought slavery was moral. Um, and they never made the argument. When you get into the antebellum period in the 19th century, some Southern theorists start saying, it's good for the slaves, that they're happy. And nobody in the 1780s is saying that. They recognize that it basically a horror and uh, indefensible, but they find it economically unavoidable. They must have it. It is their labor force. It's a heavily agrarian uh, uh, economy in the South, and it's hard work, and that's who's there. Um, so the North doesn't want to blow up everybody thinks this could blow up the convention. And to be honest, the Southerners keep saying it will if anybody threatens slavery. They stumble on it in a couple of ways. One is on tax policy, because there was an issue of apportioning taxes between the states. This had actually been dealt with by the Confederation Congress, and that's where the three-fifths number comes from. James Wilson of Pennsylvania had basically pulled it out of a hat. He said, well, they should count for something, but not too much. And everybody else said, well, it's as good as we're going to do. And when they stumbled on it for representation in the convention, which was most important, but also indirectly for tax issues, it it was easy. The three-fifths rule made as much sense as any would have. None of them made sense. I mean, these people were people, but they were people who had no rights. They did not control their own lives. So they were not going to be trusted with the vote. I mean, there were a lot of people in this country who were not slaves who were not able to vote, beginning with all women and also many people without wealth. So, it was a thoroughly pragmatic thing. Near the end of the convention, there is an effort to make slave imports permanently legal. This comes from John Rutledge of South Carolina, and it basically says there can never be a ban on the importation of slaves, and this provision of the Constitution cannot be amended. And that was terrible. And it was the one thing that finally provoked the Northerners. Uh, it was led by Gouverneur Morris, who was a Pennsylvania delegate, uh, the reaction to it. And they ultimately went into a committee to resolve the issue. It became a heated issue. And the compromise was they guaranteed the importation of slaves for 20 years, which is sort of a classic compromise and not terribly edifying, but it got them out of the room. So that that was the best they could do. I mean, pretty much anyone who signed the Constitution said, "I wish it had been better."
Yeah. It definitely was a very tedious issue because you have these southern states and these southern delegates who are threatening to walk out of the convention if slavery isn't protected, which would have just blown the whole thing up. So the northern states and sort of the anti-slavery delegates had to come to that compromise if they wanted to get this thing done and draft a constitution. So it was a very sticky situation, and probably, like I mentioned earlier, probably sowed the seeds of the Civil War. But another interesting aspect, especially if you look at this era in American history, is westward expansion. And these delegates have to keep that in mind when they're drafting this new federal government. How are we going to deal with Western territories? How are we going to admit new states to the Union? Would they be equal to the original states? Because there were some people who didn't want that. There were some people who wanted the Atlantic colonies and the Atlantic states to, because they were the originals, to be superior in a way. So, I mean, how are the delegates thinking about the growth and expansion of the U.S., and how are they keeping that in mind with the government?
Well, there was a great uh, devotion to the notion that Americans were going to occupy the whole continent, and we were going to fill it up and take it. And they knew that that would require new states to be formed. And of course, one of the great examples in history of an expansionist uh, state was the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire. And God knows they gobbled up, most of the known world at the time. Um, but nobody but Romans had rights. That was it. And you had to be a Roman. Uh, and if you were born somewhere else, too bad. Uh, and some of the East, especially in the New England delegation, some of those delegates argued that there should at least be a hierarchy where the original states had greater voting power and greater authority. And I think very appropriately, the convention as a whole did not embody that idea and simply set up a system whereby a new uh, uh, a new area that had enough population could apply to be admitted as a state. And if Congress accepted them as a state, then they would be a state like all the others, and certainly like the first 13. I think without that, we would have bought a lot of trouble, a lot of secessionist sentiment, uh, and that was, clearly the right thing to do.
Yeah, 100%. It sort of was a revolutionary, unprecedented decision at that time, because you mentioned the Roman Empire. All these new territories that are acquired by the Roman Empire are seen as subordinates or inferior to the Romans, who were the only ones who have rights. And the United States is saying, when you come into the Union as a state, you're gonna be equal to the other states who are already in the Union. So it was a very revolutionary decision, but definitely ultimately the right one, because you make a great point. There would have been a lot of secessionist sentiment had that not been the case.